My husband wants to marry my sister because she is pregnant, but the child is not my husband's. My name is Catherine. My sister Emily is pregnant, and she is crying about this man who refuses to take responsibility. My husband, Mike, felt sorry for my sister and even proposed to marry her as a concubine, but Catherine refused. Emily finally chose to give birth to the child secretly, then walked to the lake alone and ended her life. But Mike took the child home and forced me to raise him as my own. 20 years later, Catherine was still unable to get pregnant. When I was seriously ill and lying in bed, coughing up blood, Mike stood in front of the bed with the child and said coldly, "If she hadn't been so cruel and ruthless back then, your mother wouldn't have died. I want her to never have a child of her own. Now, you can take revenge with your own hands." I was strangled to death by that child himself and died with a heart full of resentment. However, when I opened my eyes again, time went back and I was reborn to the starting point of the nightmare. "Catherine, your sister is pregnant and I must marry her." The man in front of me was handsome and elegant. He was my husband, Mike Wilson, 20 years younger than I remembered. But my sister said, "The child is not yours. Don't you mind?" I said angrily. I stared at his familiar face, but there was coldness in my eyes. However, Mike seemed to be obsessed and seemed to enjoy wearing this green hat. He accused me of being unkind and not even caring about my own sister. "Catherine, Emily gave up her happiness for you. She has always been thinking about your future. Now, she has fallen into such a state. Can you bear to ignore her?" This happened 3 days ago, the first time I faced Mike after my rebirth, standing at the beginning of this disaster. The memory of the previous life was like a damp nightmare, and every scene reminded her of the coldness and ruthlessness of this man. My hand tentatively and whispered, "Emily is your biological sister. This is a matter of life and death. If I don't marry her, people will laugh at her for the rest of her life if they know she got pregnant before marriage. If she wasn't your sister, I wouldn't want to marry her. I'm helping you." There was pretended hope and pleading in his eyes, but I only felt disgust. My death emerged in my mind. Mike stood indifferently by the bed, watching the child strangle my neck with his own hands, with a cruel smile on his lips. I pulled my hand back suddenly, as if I had touched something disgusting. I even suspected that the father of this child was actually Mike, but I had no evidence. Mike's face instantly turned awkward, and his tone was a little tough. "Do you have to be so heartless? You don't even help your own loved one. Do you want her to die? You are so heartless." "Mike, you're right." I suddenly interrupted him, with a faint smile on my lips and a distant and cold tone in my voice. "You don't mind raising a child for another man, so of course I don't mind. Don't you want to give my sister a stable home?" "I agree." Mike's face froze, and he was about to explain, but I interrupted him coldly. "Since you said so, I will ask someone to prepare. Emily will move into our house in 2 days." Hearing this, Mike had a complicated look on his face, happy but also slightly dissatisfied. "Moving into the mansion in 2 days? That's a bit too hasty. After all, she's the co-wife, so you should make good preparations, inform relatives and friends, and do it decently, so as not to wrong Emily." I raised my lips sarcastically. "Mike, if you think the baby in her belly can wait, it's up to you. You can prepare for another year or 2. Make it a grand ceremony." Mike was speechless. Emily has been pregnant for 2 months, and the longer it goes, the harder it is to hide the baby. Mike gritted his teeth and finally compromised. "That's the only way. But, Catherine, I have to trouble you to arrange for someone to help Emily prepare a comfortable room. After all, she is a pregnant woman, and it would be worthy of her and the child if she lived in a better place." Catherine glanced at him indifferently, didn't say anything else, turned around and left, not wanting to stay even for a second. To be honest, the wisest thing to do would be to file for divorce immediately. But they had only been married for 2 months, and if they divorced now, no matter what the reason was, rumors would point to Catherine and even implicate the marriages of other girls in the family. "Forget it, let's wait a little longer." Catherine sneered in her heart. It won't be too late to leave after watching this farce. 3 days later, Emily officially moved into the Wilson family mansion. That day, I passed by her yard and saw from afar Emily holding her waist with one hand and directing the servants with the other hand, asking them to cook bird's nest porridge in an aggressive tone. Mike personally picked the yard for Emily, and after careful decoration, it is almost indistinguishable from my main house. Emily noticed me passing by and quickly asked the servant to invite her in. I didn't want to pay attention to it, but finally decided to go in and watch this good show. Emily sat on a chair covered with velvet cushions, touching her belly with a smile on her face. Catherine, for your happiness, I gave you the chance to marry Mike. I never thought that today we would still live in the same house and become sisters on equal terms. She deliberately emphasized the word on an equal footing, but the next second she glanced at her belly and pretended to change her words casually. But when I give birth to this child, Mike's eldest son, I'm afraid he will be taller than you. Don't mind it, sister. I smiled slightly. My eyes fell on Emily's belly. I feel sorry for my sister. You gave up on Mike because you disliked her ordinary family background. You wanted to marry a richer man, but he didn't want you. Otherwise, how could you end up like this? Emily's face turned pale instantly. Mike happened to walk in with a smile on his face. Emily quickly wiped her eyes and raised her voice. I know. I stole your husband. You have reason to feel uncomfortable. I don't want to stay here either. I will move out after the baby is born. Mike's face changed, and he quickly walked forward and hugged Emily. Emily, don't be like this. Catherine is not that kind of person. She will definitely understand you. I lazily leaned back in my chair and sneered. How could that be? Seeing your family of 3 living in harmony and happiness makes me so happy. Mike breathed a sigh of relief and patted Emily's shoulder gently. You see, Catherine has never been a petty person. The corners of Emily's mouth twitched. She was clearly full of grievances, but she couldn't express them, so she could only force a smile. I showed a worried expression again and said slowly, But, sister, will the biological father of this child come to our house one day to recognize him? If that person is just a poor boy with no power, it would be fine, but if he is a big shot with a strong background, I am afraid that our Wilson family will find it difficult to deal with it. Her gaze made Emily fidget. Emily quickly looked outside the door and confirmed that the servants were busy in the distance before she whispered, Catherine, don't ask any more questions. This child is Mike's flesh and blood. No one can take him away. However, when Mike heard this, the smile on his face froze. Although he felt pity for Emily, he still had some doubts in his heart. He looked at Emily hesitantly, with a hint of inquiry in his eyes. Emily felt wronged and sobbed, covering her face. I was harmed. I really don't know who it was. Hearing this, Mike finally softened his heart and reached out to hold her in his arms to comfort her. Emily, don't think about it anymore. This is your eldest sister's sad story. Don't mention it again. I will raise this child as my own flesh and blood in the future, and I will never allow anyone to look down on them. I raised my eyebrows, stood up, and said lazily, whatever you like. For the next few months, things seemed to be on the surface peaceful between Mike, Emily, and me. I sent a lot of nourishing food to Emily and arranged for a doctor to check the condition of the fetus every 2 days. I clearly remember that in the previous life, this child was malnourished, and Emily was always worried, so she almost didn't make it past the full month. In this life, she had to make sure that this child was born healthy and plump. Unexpectedly, Mike saw this move as a sign of her magnanimity. That night, Mike came over to have dinner with Catherine. After dinner, he had no intention of leaving. Instead, he dismissed the maid in the room with an ambiguous smile on his face. Catherine, he said softly, on our wedding night, I was still thinking about Emily. I didn't consummate the marriage with you. I really wronged you. Why don't we just... Hearing this, I felt nauseous, but on the surface I just looked away and closed my eyes. Mike didn't notice my disgust at all and continued to speak to himself. Now that you can accommodate Emily and let her live here peacefully, we are all very grateful to you. I have always felt that I should compensate you. After Emily gives birth to her first son, I will have our own child with you. If the first child is a daughter, we will continue to have children until we have a son. Of course, this will have to wait until Emily gives birth. I don't want her to be unhappy and affect her health. I couldn't listen any longer, so I raised my hand and interrupted coldly. Don't worry about my affairs. You should just take good care of your sister. Mike was obviously touched by my tolerance. He held my hand and said sincerely, Catherine, I didn't expect you to be so considerate. It's my blessing to marry you. He paused for a moment and continued, Emily and I have discussed this. We want to hold a grand banquet after the baby is 1 month old. This is the first grandson of our Wilson family, and it must be grand and dignified. I'll have to ask you to take care of this matter. Catherine sneered in her heart. These words were exactly what she wanted. Of course, we have to have a full moon banquet, and we have to have it in a grand way. In her previous life, she had personally taken care of this child for a few days and had long noticed that his broken eyebrow was exactly the same as that of his biological father, the then distinguished Duke Anderson. The child's appearance, especially his thick eyebrows and the contours of his facial features, can be seen at a glance. In her previous life, she tried to cover up for them, and even didn't dare to bring the child with her in various occasions, fearing that it would cause gossip. However, in this life, she would never cover up anything for them again. Thinking of this, I readily agreed to Mike. Okay, let's invite all the celebrities and nobles in the city to this full moon banquet, especially the Duchess Anderson, who must be there. Time passed quickly. On the day Emily gave birth, Mike was so anxious that he stayed outside the delivery room all night, listening to her screams without closing his eyes. I didn't care at all. I put on my earplugs early and fell asleep peacefully. The next morning, after hearing that the baby was born safely, she got up leisurely and went over to take a look. This child was well fed in the womb and was a full circle bigger than in the previous life, with more relaxed features. But the eyebrow that was slightly broken in the middle was still exactly the same. I looked at the child, the corners of my mouth slightly raised, and a hint of coldness flashed in my eyes. It's really the same genes. The newborn baby has sparse hair and not yet distinct eyebrows. Emily did not notice the abnormality of the faintly broken eyebrow. Instead, she raised her chin slightly with pride. Catherine, I'm sorry, this child of ours has taken the title of the eldest son of the family. He will be the heir of the family in the future. Mike took over the conversation faster than Catherine and said with a smile, You are sisters. Isn't Emily's child your child? Catherine, don't you think so? I have seen Mike's shamelessness before, so I was not moved by his words. I just raised the corners of my mouth and said lightly, You really think highly of me. I can't give birth to such a good child. I immediately stood up and looked at Emily with a half smile. It's time to prepare for the baby's full moon banquet. Sister, have a good rest. I'll go get busy. Mike quickly agreed. Yes. You are still thoughtful. Prepare early and don't rush. I couldn't stand listening to him anymore, so I turned around and left, sneering in my heart. I've lived 2 lifetimes and met a lot of men, but I've never seen a willing cuckold like Mike. On the day of the full moon banquet, almost all the celebrities in Washington were present. Although the Wilson family has been gradually declining, Mike's grandfather used to have good connections. And with the title of the eldest grandson Manhwa, everyone is still willing to give him face and support him. Before the banquet started, one of the ladies took the initiative to suggest going to see the children. I led everyone to Emily's room with enthusiasm. Although Emily's yard was decorated decently, due to her delicate status, old lady Margaret had banned her from showing up in such occasions. The old lady was opposed to the woman coming in at first, but Mike threatened to run away from home, so she had no choice but to agree to let Emily in. Emily was originally upset that she couldn't stand out in the spotlight in the house, but unexpectedly, a large group of ladies suddenly rushed in. She immediately started to greet them with a smile on her face. The city is big. It is not too big. People in the circle have heard about Emily's surrogacy. The Duchess of U was the first one who disliked Emily. She glanced at the child, curled her lips coldly, and said to me, This child is raised under your knees, and you will definitely teach him well in the future. The smile on Emily's face froze instantly. The Duchess of Jordan beside her also agreed with a smile. Look at this plump and fair child. He's really well taken care of. Catherine, you must have put a lot of thought into it, right? I smiled back calmly. No, he just has a good physique. At this time, the little daughter of the Duchess of U stared at the baby's eyebrows for a long time and suddenly pulled her mother's hand in surprise. Mom, his eyebrows are similar to Dad's eyebrows. As soon as the words fell, the air around them seemed to freeze. The room suddenly became so quiet that you could hear a pin drop. The Duchess of U had a subtle expression on her face, but before she could speak, her little daughter said loudly, He really looks like Dad, and he also looks like me. Mom, is this Dad's child? Emily's face suddenly turned pale as paper. Although the ladies present did not say it explicitly, their eye contact showed doubt and contempt on their faces. Before the banquet officially started, the Duchess of U got up and left on the spot. The noble ladies who were on good terms with the Duchess of U also found excuses to leave one after another. The huge Wilson house suddenly became deserted. Most of the remaining people were either unaware of what was going on or ordinary guests who came to join in the fun. Not long after, old lady Margaret sent someone over to ask why the party suddenly became dull. I just lowered my head and explained. Emily spoke out of turn and made the wife of the king of U unhappy, so she was allowed to leave. Upon hearing this, Margaret was so angry that she cursed. She is such a tactless person. She forced her way into the Wilson family's house while pregnant with a bastard. If Mike hadn't said that she was pregnant with our grandson, I would have kicked her out long ago. Why did you let her meet the guests? I bowed my head and replied, "It was my negligence. I will pay more attention next time." This sensational full moon banquet, apart from its quiet ending and the old lady's rage, did not seem to cause much trouble on the surface. The Prince of Yu's palace was unusually quiet, with not a single word reported about the scandal. Mike knew nothing about this and happily ordered 2 big golden pigs for his child to celebrate his full moon. In Emily's yard, this night was particularly lively and festive. The servants discussed among themselves. Now that Mrs. Emily has given birth to Mike's eldest son, it's hard to say who will be the real owner of this family in the future. Emily's ambitions grew. She thought the original yard was too small, so she had the wall demolished and expanded it. The craftsmen were busy as always, and the noise was known to the entire Wilson family house. My servants only discussed it in private at first, but later they couldn't stand it anymore, and finally someone mustered up the courage to report it to her. "Madam, she has become so arrogant, and you don't care at all?" I tilted my head slightly and glanced at the bright sunshine outside the window, with a hint of ambiguous smile on my lips. "It's a nice day today." "Madam," the maid was a little anxious. I just smiled softly. "Why are you in such a hurry? The best is yet to come. In fact, it is now certain that Emily's lover is the Duke of Yu, but he is nearly 50 years old and has only 3 daughters and no sons. He refused to acknowledge the baby in Emily's belly because he suspected that she was deliberately relying on him. He was worried that the child was not his, and he was afraid of exposing the scandal. But after seeing the child, the Princess of Yu instantly realized that this child was most likely the Duke of Yu's son. She was more afraid than anyone else that the truth would be revealed, and she didn't want the King of Yu to know about it. She was even more nervous than the Wilson family, and she tried hard to cover up the scandal. But there is no wall that is impenetrable, especially when there is a living air vent like Catherine living in Wilson's house. Catherine put down the silk thread in her hand, rubbed her wrist, and was about to go for a walk in the garden when she saw the maid Alice running in hurriedly. "Madam, something terrible has happened. The Duke of Yu has come to our house to snatch the child." The scene suddenly became chaotic. The Duke of Yu didn't care about his reputation. He was 50 years old and had countless love affairs, but all the women he had had were daughters. He always hoped to have a son to inherit his title. In his early years, he has been acting recklessly in recent years, committing countless acts of robbery, corruption, and abuse of power. At this moment, he was standing outside Emily's yard, shouting in a loud voice, "What Wilson family? It's nothing but an empty shell. How dare you detain my own son? Who do you think you are? I tell you, I must take this child away today. Your Wilson family is willing to be cuckolded, but my dignified Yuewang mansion will not let my bloodline flow out." The old lady Margaret, who was standing nearby, was so angry at what she heard that she almost fainted. Mike gritted his teeth, stood in front of the courtyard gate, glaring. He then realized that the child's biological father was actually the Duke of Yu. When he thought of Emily being bullied by this old man, he felt distressed and angry. "King Yu, this is the residence of the Wilson family. Emily and John are my wife and son. I will never allow anyone to bully them, let alone take them away from me." Of Yu sneered, his tone full of contempt. "Who bullied them?" asked this Emily. "Did she climb into my bed on her own? I never forced her to do anything. You took a bunch of junk and brought it home as treasure, and you blame others for being intolerant?" Of Yu was too lazy to argue with Mike, so he simply raised his voice and shouted, "Emily, take the child and go back with me. I will ensure that you will live a life of wealth and glory for the rest of your life. Come out now." Mike's face flushed, his fists clenched, his body trembling slightly, and he was obviously on the verge of exploding. In the end, he suppressed his anger and said in a low and hoarse voice, "As long as Emily doesn't want it, no one can take her and John away. Ido." A charming voice came from behind him, and Mike's body suddenly stiffened. "Your Excellency the Duke, you are finally here." Emily rushed out, holding the child. She completely ignored Mike standing beside her and threw herself into the arms of the Duke of Yu. "Your Excellency the Duke." Emily's face was painted with delicate powder. Her skin was white and rosy, and her eyes were full of tenderness. "I have been waiting for you so hard." The Duke of Yu's eyes fell on the child, and the more he looked at him, the happier he became. That face looked exactly like his own. He laughed and took the child from Emily's arms, almost ecstatic with excitement. "Ha ha ha! There's an heir! The Prince of Yu's mansion finally has an heir." Emily raised her head with a smile. Your Excellency the Duke, I risked my life to give birth to this child. This is not only a child, but also my innocence. Innocent. The Duke of you stopped laughing. He glanced at Mike, and a sarcastic smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. Emily hastily explained. In the past year, in order to give birth to the Duke's legitimate son, I had no choice but to temporarily live in the Wilson family. But please rest assured that I have always been a virgin and have never done anything disrespectful. Mike stood there, his body stiff and his vision darkening. Her words were like a knife, stabbing his heart. His memory went back to those awkward nights when Emily always rejected him with various excuses. He never expected that she was keeping her chastity for the Duke of you. The Duke of you turned around and prepared to leave, and Emily followed closely behind him with a brisk and excited step. Mike rushed forward unwillingly, blocking them, and asked Emily through gritted teeth, Are you really going to leave? You really have no feelings for me? Emily saw that her goal had been achieved, but was afraid that the Duke of you would misunderstand her, so she hurriedly said, Mike, I know you have feelings for me, but since I have already followed the Duke, I will never commit myself to anyone else. I have always treated you as just my sister's husband. Sister's husband? Mike felt like he had heard a big joke. He remembered how Emily had leaned gently into his arms and told him about her grievances, but she didn't say that at the time. Even so, you should save some face for the Wilson family. Mike's eyes were red, almost desperate. We held a grand full moon party for John a few days ago, and everyone in the city knows that our Wilson family has welcomed a grandson. But now you have taken your child to the Prince of Yu's palace. How do you let others see the Wilson family? What do you think of me? Emily sneered and pushed his hand away without hesitation. Mike, you did all this willingly. I never forced you. Now you turn around and blame me. It's too unkind. After saying that, she left with the Duke of you triumphantly, leaving Mike standing there blankly with an empty expression. The news that the Duke of you had kidnapped the child and Emily quickly spread throughout the city. Old Lady Margaret was so angry that she was bedridden. My mother also came specially. After hearing the whole story, she stamped her feet in anger. She really raised her status. From a concubine of the Wilson family, she became the concubine of the Duke of Yu. She sneered and continued. Now she has a son in her arms, and she is enjoying great glory in the Yu Wang mansion. The Yu Wang concubine is also a fool. She actually doesn't understand the principle of get rid of the mother and keep the son. Her voice became sharper and sharper. Back then, Emily's mother broke into the Wilson family with her belly bulging. If I had been ruthless and kicked her out at that time, I wouldn't have ended up like this. As a result, more than 10 years later, her daughter used the same trick again, and she succeeded. It's really infuriating. I lowered my head to embroider the flowers, with a faint smile on my lips. Mother, what's wrong with letting her enjoy the glory for a while? Let's not talk about the Yu Palace for now. Have you discussed the matter I mentioned last time with the people in your family? The mother paused and sighed. They were unwilling before, but now everyone in the city knows that Mike is a heartless man. For Emily, he stepped on his newlywed wife as a stepping stone and even dared to mention the term equal wife. She paused and continued. After all the fuss, it turns out that the child is not from the Wilson family. Now the Wilson family has become the laughingstock of the whole city. As she spoke, my mother took out a letter from her sleeve and handed it to me. Think it over carefully. The clan has already discussed this matter. No matter what decision you make, the clan will ensure that you get out of it safely. As soon as the mother left, Mike came. Before he even entered the room, a strong smell of alcohol wafted in. He wasn't completely drunk, but his haggard face and distraught look made him not even bother to hide it. I looked up at him and sneered in my heart. This half-dead appearance is nothing compared to the efforts and experiences of my previous life. In my previous life, I worked hard for the Wilson family, managing this crumbling shell from top to bottom. I have a clear conscience towards Emily's son. He never neglected his food, clothing, housing, and transportation, and I spent a lot of money to hire the best teachers for his studies. He even wanted to learn martial arts, so I hired a top coach. But in the end, this father and son had no conscience. Catherine, I have nothing now. You are all I have. Mike sat opposite me, his eyes bloodshot, and his face showed his usual regret. I'm sorry, he said, his voice hoarse. I'm sorry. He didn't know how many times he had said this, but every time he said it, he still had to do the things he was supposed to do. Catherine, his eyes were red, as if he was moved by his own true feelings. I know that I was wrong before, and I was confused. From now on, Let's start over and live a good life? Okay. His expression was full of affection, like a prodigal husband. I raised the corners of my mouth slightly, revealing an ambiguous smile. Mike, if Emily hadn't taken the child to the Prince of Yu's palace, you would never feel guilty towards me in your life, right? My words stunned him. Even though you treat me, your legal wife, as a transparent person and trample on my dignity, you still think it's all natural. You let me work hard to maintain the family business and raise the reputation of the Wilson family. When I was emptied and used up, you turned around and accused me of hindering your true love. Yes or no? The tenderness on Mike's face froze, and then turned into anger. Are you arguing with your husband? Isn't this what all wives should do? Which wife doesn't work so hard for the family business? How come others can do it, but you can't? His voice became more and more excited. If you insist on being so petty, then let me tell you, Catherine, without Emily, there are still many women out there. If you are willing to stay alone in an empty room, then stay alone for the rest of your life. Mike stood up angrily and pretended to leave. I reached out and grabbed his sleeve. He stopped and turned around with a smug smile. Do you regret it now? I didn't say anything, but just gently pushed the envelope my mother handed me in front of him. The smile on Mike's face disappeared without a trace. Emily's case made the Wilson family a laughing stock. When the two families discussed the divorce, the Wilson family barely brought any family elders with them, so we had all the advantages. We even got back almost all of the dowry items. Old Lady Margaret sat on the high seat, moving her lips a few times, but she didn't say anything. When I promoted Emily to be my second wife, she repeatedly advised me to see the big picture. Now it seems that she can see the big picture herself. When I returned to the Lynn family, my brother and sister-in-law welcomed me warmly. My father has been in poor health recently, and he was so angry after hearing about Emily's incident that he was bedridden. Now my brother is almost entirely in charge of the family. My sister-in-law saw that I was in a low mood and was afraid that I would be bored in the yard, so she often accompanied me for a walk. But every time I went out, I would inevitably run into Emily. Emily came back on purpose to irritate us. She wanted us to know how good her life was now. She is indeed very glamorous now, covered in jewels and looking very glorious. One day, I was holding a pair of jasper earrings in my hand. Emily saw them and sneered. Why? After being divorced, you can only wear these inferior goods? She turned to the jewelry store owner next to her and said, Shopkeeper Wu, don't let this kind of person in the future. An abandoned woman has a bad reputation, so don't let her affect your business. Before I could say anything, my sister-in-law took the rose hairpin from Emily's hand and said, Our Catherine wants this hairpin. She sneered. Even if Catherine divorces, she will divorce as the legal wife of the Wilson family. Unlike some people, who do whatever it takes just to become a concubine. Emily turned pale with anger, but she couldn't find any words to refute. My sister-in-law pulled me and turned to leave. After walking a few steps, there was a commotion on the street. Many soldiers rushed out and blocked the surrounding shops tightly, not allowing anyone to go out. Pedestrians on the street were either driven aside or hacked to death on the spot, and their bodies were thrown on the ground at random. We hurried back to the store. Emily's maid was so scared that she kept shouting, Aunt, we shouldn't have gone out. The prince is right. Something big must have happened today. On the street, a group of cavalry passed by in a mighty procession. The sound of horse hooves was deafening. When they went far away, the street was dead silent. Emily huddled in the corner, cursing under her breath. Sure enough, nothing good will happen if you run into a jinx like her. My sister-in-law is impatient, and she hit back directly. What are you talking about? You dirty bastard. You can't even speak honestly. Emily shut up immediately. The sky gradually darkened, and the sound of hurried horse hooves was heard on the street again. When the sound approached the shop door, I was suddenly pushed from behind and fell out. Along with the exclamations of the crowd, Emily's sharp voice was like a devil. Go to hell, bitch. A tall warhorse rushed towards me, its hooves almost stepping on me. At the critical moment, the horse stood up and let out a sharp neigh. I barely dodged it and fell to the ground in embarrassment. The young general on horseback, wearing a silver helmet and red armor, shouted hastily, Get out of the way. Are you trying to kill yourself? My sister-in-law rushed over and pulled me back to the shop from the ground. My legs were so weak that I could hardly stand up. In less than a quarter of an hour, a new group of officers and soldiers were stationed on the streets, and scarlet lanterns were lit up in the capital. Soon after, the family carriage arrived hurriedly, and my mother and brother rushed into the shop with nervous looks. carefully checking whether we were injured. Seeing that we were safe, they finally breathed a sigh of relief. My sister-in-law couldn't help but ask, "What happened?" The brother looked solemn. His eyes swept over Emily, who was huddled in the corner, and whispered, "The crown prince colluded with the king of Yu, Marquis of Qingyan and others, intending to launch a palace coup. However, the Mu family army has already put down the rebellion, and the rebels have been escorted into the palace. Your Majesty is safe and sound. Tonight, we are finally safe." Emily's eyes widened, and she muttered to herself, "Impossible. Up with it." The faces of her mother and brother were not very good. Emily was now a member of the Yuewang mansion, and this incident involved treason. No one could predict whether the Lin family would be implicated. "Let's go home first," my brother said gently. Emily suddenly rushed over, grabbed her brother's sleeve, and cried, I want to go home with you. I want to go back to the Lin family too." The mother's face was filled with disgust, and she pushed her away fiercely. "Haven't you two sinned enough? Get as far away from me as possible. I get angry when I see you." Emily knew that the Lin family was her only lifeline, so how could she let go? She held her brother's hand tightly and begged with tears in her eyes. "Good brother, please save my sister and the child. If something happens to me, can the Lin family escape responsibility?" Her brother frowned, obviously not wanting to get entangled with her here, so he winked. The two maids beside her mother immediately stepped forward and forcibly pulled Emily away. The carriage went farther and farther away. Emily stumbled after it, crying as she ran. "You can't leave me behind. I'm from the Lin family." The atmosphere in the car was very heavy. "Will this matter implicate us?" asked my sister-in-law worriedly. My brother sighed and shook his head, saying, "If His Majesty shows mercy, we may be spared. But if His Majesty is furious, the Lin family, Your Majesty is merciful." I said, my tone calm and firm, "It will not implicate our Lin family." The next day, the Prince of Yu's mansion was ransacked. Emily was imprisoned together with her so-called eldest son, and it was said that a large amount of gold and silver treasures were found in her yard. The King of Yu might not be so fond of her, and most of these things were looted from the Wilson family. The Lin family did not receive the charge of being implicated, but instead received an imperial edict of reward from the emperor. After all, I have lived an extra life, so I naturally know that the King of Yu and the Crown Prince were plotting a rebellion. In my previous life, they also failed. In this life, in order to clear the Lin family of suspicion in advance, I had to express my loyalty to the emperor early. A month ago, I revealed the King of Yu's plan to the wife of Duke Zhao. After verifying it, Duke Zhao immediately reported it to the emperor. Duke Zhao is a loyal and honest man and did not take credit for my achievements. "How did you know about this in advance?" my brother asked me in surprise afterwards. Even the Duke of Zhao came to ask in person. I just smiled and replied, "Emily was so proud of herself that she accidentally revealed some information while showing off. I followed the clues and guessed it." Duke Zhao frowned slightly, seeming to doubt this explanation. I added calmly, "Fortunately, the King of Yu is also involved. Otherwise, this plan would be perfect." Duke Zhao's expression suddenly eased. He nodded and said, "That's right. It's not uncommon for a man like the King of Yu to leak secrets to his concubines." From then on, I went from being a divorced abandoned woman to becoming Princess Onping, personally conferred by the emperor. When the news spread, the capital was in an uproar. Soon, the Lin family's door was almost broken down by matchmakers seeking marriage, and I became the most popular person in the capital. Marcus' appearance took me by surprise. The doorman of the Lin residence was very tactful. He didn't even let him in. Instead, he picked up a broom and kicked him out, shouting angrily, "If you dare to come again, I'll beat you to death." The boy was only 10 years old, but he looked quite imposing with his hands on his hips. But Mark seemed to have taken to the Lin residence, guarding the gate all day, waiting for me to leave. My mother couldn't stand it anymore, so she sent people to scold and even beat him, but he still stubbornly shouted. I was blind before and mistook pearls for fish eyes. But no matter what, how can a married couple who got married later in life compare to the original couple? I only have Catherine in my heart. The mother was so angry that her face turned pale and she held her chest and gasped. My sister-in-law came over and advised me, "Catherine, don't be fooled by his fake face. He is begging you now, but the Jiang family's assets have been emptied by Emily, and they can't hold on any longer. Look at you. You are now a princess appointed by the emperor, and he just wants to eat gigolo." She casually pulled out a few portraits and spread them out in front of me. Look, these are the best talents in the capital, more than 10 times better than Mark. If you don't like those outside, there is a little cousin from my mother's side who is gentle and considerate, and he will definitely suit your taste. Why bother looking back at this stinky shit? My sister-in-law is the daughter of a general, and she always speaks straightforwardly. I couldn't help but be amused by her, and nodded in agreement. Indeed, stinky shit should look like stinky shit. Late at night, Mark still lingered outside the Lynn residence, squatting at the foot of the wall and refusing to leave. He was shivering in the cold wind, hunching his neck and looking up at the dark night sky. Suddenly, he heard a rustling sound above his head. When he looked up subconsciously, a basin of dirty water mixed with feces and urine poured down, soaking him thoroughly. Mark was choked, and urine flowed down his face into his mouth and nose. He retched desperately a few times and finally ran away in embarrassment. In a blink of an eye, a month passed. On the third day of the 12th lunar month, the air in the capital was freezing cold. That morning, I was still curled up in bed when my sister-in-law threw me out of bed and dragged me out to the street to watch the rebel parade. On the street, wooden prison carts were lined up one after another, like a winding giant worm. The prisoners in the prison carts were all the prince's party and people from the Yuewang Palace who participated in the rebellion. My sister-in-law sighed. Thanks to you for reporting the news in advance. Otherwise, our Lin family would have been implicated. Hey, look, that's someone from the Prince of Yu's mansion. I followed her gaze and soon saw Emily in the prison van. She was covered in wounds and looked haggard. In her arms was the child who was less than 2 years old, Jiang Qingzhang, or now Zhou Qingzhang. He was skinny, with a big head and a small body, and his dark eyes looked confused and helpless. But when his eyes swept across the crowd, they stared straight at me. The little child stood up shakily, holding onto the wooden railing of the prison van. He opened his mouth and tried to shout something, but the streets were filled with people, so I couldn't hear what he was shouting. Judging from his lip shape, he was repeating 4 words. Mother, save me. I smiled softly, but my smile was cold. I see. This child is so lucky. There is still a long way to go in the future, and he has plenty of time to endure all this. And at this moment, I finally returned to the starting point of this nightmare. Catherine, a clear young voice suddenly came from behind. The sister-in-law turned around when she heard the voice and immediately patted the young man in blue, saying angrily, "Where did you come from? You scared me." The boy ignored her teasing and looked at me with a burning gaze, his face full of surprise. "It's you?" I was slightly stunned, obviously not recognizing him. Seeing my confusion, the boy smiled and said, "That day when we were forcing the emperor to abdicate, you fell out of the street and my horse almost stepped on you. Don't you remember?" I suddenly realized it and bowed to him. "It's you. Thanks to you for reining in your horse in time that day." I didn't have time to thank you. My sister-in-law stood aside, rolling her eyes, and suddenly interrupted. "Oh, the bitch in my yard is probably about to give birth. I have to go back to deliver the baby. Catherine, you can watch the excitement for a while longer. I will let Xingyin take you back later." After she finished speaking, she pouted at the boy and said in a loud voice, "Boy, this is a chance for you. Grab it yourself." As soon as he finished speaking, the boy's face turned red and his ears were stained with a hint of crimson. The crowd on the street watched as the prison van moved forward, and the noise gradually faded away. Snowflakes began to fall from the sky, swirling in the cold wind and landing on people's shoulders. Alex hurriedly took out an umbrella from his bag and handed it to me. You use it." I looked at his clumsy, yet serious look, and my heart felt warm. However, I did not take the umbrella. Instead, I slightly leaned to the side, took a step closer to him, looked up and smiled. "Let's go together." The boy's cheeks flushed instantly, and a hint of immature blush appeared on his fair face. He was stunned for a moment, then nodded stiffly, opened the umbrella, and carefully tilted it towards me. Snowflakes fell on the umbrella, making a slight rustling sound. But Mu Qingyun's expression seemed awkward and nervous, and even the strength of his grip on the umbrella became a little stiff. At this moment, the flying snow is like a dream, and the young man is like a painting.